Yeah, you mentioned Uniswap, and maybe we should spend a little time on the phenomenon of Uniswap. And like you said, when you first looked at it, you were not necessarily convinced that the small amount of premium you get as a liquidity provider would allow that platform to thrive, and it has. I mean, it's probably changed everything, and I don't know if anybody saw that coming in 2019. Maybe you did, but it's something I try to explain to my students. The cost of liquidity, and it's really hard. When I was at Bankers Trust, my job was to quote, fix floating swaps to these institutions that were speaking with our sales team. And I was going down to four decimal places on a swap. So again, it was fixed floating, and it was a 6-year term, and your rate is 5.6431%. And if I was off, I got nailed. And that's what happens to market makers. You get nailed if you're off, and you take the hit. But of course, you make the bid offer when you're not. And the closest thing I saw was when I go to visit Chicago, and I'd see the 300 American football size player guys screaming in a pit who were creating liquidity for the market. That doesn't really exist anymore in a physical sense, but they were being paid to basically make two-way markets, even though big whales were coming in and the funds were coming in and Goldman Sachs was over here. They saw the information, but they only made that bid offer, and it was really hard to quantify the value of the liquidity. And that's why when I saw what was happening in DeFi, I was like, wow, they found a way to actually pay you for liquidity. It was kind of mind-blowing to me because this never existed in the traditional financial markets. And maybe you can expand on that a little bit. And like you said, it's not about theory. It's really about practice, and do people do it, and does it work? So tell me your thoughts on that. And yeah, do you agree or disagree with any of that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the adverse selection cost you're describing is like very much a real thing when you're doing trading, right? At the same time, it took me a while to realize that there's, the LP shares are more like ETFs than they are like liquidity provision on Uniswap is a little bit more like an ETF than it is like I'm a market maker. And I think from a sort of profit standpoint, and it took us about a year to prove like the mathematical formalism for like how you get to that, and like how you can write the math out to show that it looks like an ETF. But it because of that, if you flip your mindset to something where it's like, oh, I actually just want exposure to these two assets, and I know I'm going to pay some holding costs, but I also don't really want to think about which direction I'm holding at the end. I just I probably want both of them in some proportion. Like the Uniswap or balancer model actually just does kind of make some sense. I think the other thing that's important to note is that there are a lot of people who are more sophisticated liquidity providers, especially nowadays. And they really do migrate their capital from pool to pool, trying to optimize yield. And I think that there's the fact that there's like a spectrum between the like super professional and the people who just want the passive exposure like an ETF. It does resemble the normal market in a very similar way to how high frequency trading kind of like flatlined while ETFs bloomed, even though ETFs in some sense are kind of a money losing asset to hold. There are a lot of ETFs that you can go find that don't track the index. The thing they're supposed to be matched to, they don't track because like every time they make a trade, there's like 5 hedge funds that have some model of like how to predict when that ETF rebalances, and they front run them, right? That happens all the time. Like I guarantee you that's like 50% of like large hedge funds that do that type of stuff. And there's just so much demand for that because there's just a ton of retail demand that's like, I just want to own these assets, and I don't care that I'm paying more of this cost because to me, I'm like thinking on a long enough time horizon, it doesn't matter. And somehow that the LP mindset is somehow a little bit closer to that. So another thing we do, so we talked about our risk products, but another thing we do at Gauntlet is incentive management. And what that means is, how much should different protocols pay for liquidity incentives? So like SushiSwap, for instance, pays rewards for different pools. And so for instance, we help them manage like how much should they put in each pool. Like you don't want to give a ton of incentive to a pool that has no volume and is a random coin. Whereas you do want to give a lot of incentive to certain pools, but not so much that there's just a ton of capital sitting there relative to the trading volume. So we help them save like $200-300 million of like spend, because they spend a lot of money on attracting liquidity. And the cool thing from that is one of the things we learned is there really are these like different types of liquidity providers. There's really like the never touches they put it in and they haven't done the interaction in their wallet for a year. And then of course there are people who have made these sort of farming funds that are constantly churning through. And there's a spectrum between those. And I think, this is why I think the types of things of like simulating the users in these systems to understand, what the incentive should be or what the risk parameter should be is kind of powerful. But it also kind of says something about the nature of these LP shares, which is that they really do have this like passive to active spectrum. That is, I think that's something that exists in the normal finance world, and is one of the reasons, right? Like, there are a lot of hedge funds who make more money than high frequency trading firms by just doing this ETF front running.